The year was 1884, when the vast expanse of the Dakota Territory promised new beginnings to those brave enough to claim them. In this harsh land where winter winds carved stories into weathered faces and hope was often the only currency that mattered, two broken souls would discover that sometimes the greatest strength emerges from the ashes of our deepest wounds. This is the remarkable story of Margaret Sullivan, a woman fleeing a past that threatened to destroy her, and Samuel Mitchell, a one-armed blacksmith who had learned that physical scars were nothing compared to the wounds that lived in the heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as Margaret Sullivan stepped down from the dusty stagecoach in the frontier town of Cedar Falls. Her dark green traveling dress, though practical, bore the subtle quality of fine tailoring that spoke of better days and circumstances far removed from this windswept settlement. At 28, Margaret possessed the kind of quiet beauty that didn't announce itself but lingered in memory. Her auburn hair pinned back with precision and her green eyes holding depths that suggested stories better left untold. She clutched a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world, along with a letter that had brought her across half a continent to meet a man she knew only through carefully worded correspondence. Samuel Mitchell, blacksmith and landowner, seeking a wife for companionship and partnership in building a life on the Dakota frontier. His letters had been honest about his disability, direct about his expectations, and refreshingly free of the flowery romanticism that made her stomach turn. What he hadn't mentioned, and what Margaret hadn't disclosed, were the shadows that had driven her to answer his advertisement in the first place. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Peterson, who'd made polite conversation during the final leg of their journey, tipped his hat as he handed down her single trunk. "Mitchell Place is about 3 miles north of town, ma'am," he said, his weathered face kind but curious. "You sure you don't want to rest up at the hotel first? It's been a long journey from back east." Margaret shook her head, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly despite her composed demeanor. "I've sent word of my arrival. Mr. Mitchell will be expecting me." The lie came easily, practiced from months of careful deception. In truth, she had sent no word, had fled Chicago 3 days ahead of schedule when certain complications had made her departure suddenly urgent. Peterson studied her with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd transported enough desperate souls to recognize another. "Well then, I reckon Jake Morrison over at the livery can get you a horse and wagon. Mitchell's a good man from what folks say. Lost his arm in the war, but never lost his spirit. You'll do fine out there." As the stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust, Margaret stood alone on the wooden sidewalk of Cedar Falls' main street, the weight of her decision settling around her like the prairie wind. The town was larger than she'd expected, but still raw with newness, false-fronted buildings standing defiantly against the endless sky. She could hear the ring of hammers from construction sites, the lowing of cattle from the stockyards, and the general bustle of a community determined to carve civilization from wilderness. At the Morrison livery, Jake Morrison proved to be a thin, energetic man with kind eyes and an easy smile. "You must be the lady Samuel's been expecting," he said without prompting, apparently having heard about the arrangement through the small town's efficient gossip network. "He's been working like a man possessed these past weeks, getting everything ready." Margaret felt a stab of guilt at the thought of Samuel Mitchell preparing for her arrival while she'd been running from her past like a thief in the night. Has he spoken of me?" she asked hesitantly. Morrison hitched up a gentle mare to a small wagon, his movements efficient and practiced, only to say he was grateful for the chance at companionship. "Samuel's not one for sharing personal business, but a man can see he's been looking forward to having someone to share his life with." Been alone too long, if you ask me. The 3-mile journey north from town took Margaret through rolling prairie, dotted with the occasional farmstead, each one representing someone's dream of prosperity and permanence. The September sun was warm despite the cool breeze, and she found herself relaxing slightly as the horse maintained a steady pace along the well-worn track. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a life where she might build something worthwhile instead of constantly looking over her shoulder. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came as a smudge of black smoke against the horizon, too dark and too concentrated to be from a cook fire or chimney. Margaret's heart began to race as the acrid smell reached her nostrils, carried on the prairie wind like a harbinger of disaster. She urged the horse faster, standing in the wagon to get a better view of what lay ahead. What she saw made her blood run cold. Where Samuel Mitchell's homestead should have stood, only blackened ruins remained. The house, barn, and outbuildings had been reduced to charred skeletons, still smoldering in places where the fire had burned hottest. Wisps of smoke rose like prayers into the afternoon sky, carrying with them the dreams and plans of a man she'd never met but had promised to marry. Margaret brought the wagon to a halt at the edge of what had once been a yard, her mind struggling to process the devastation before her. The remains of furniture and personal belongings were scattered among the ashes, some pieces recognizable, others melted into unidentifiable shapes by the fierce heat. A child's toy horse lay half buried in soot near what had been the front porch, its painted surface blistered but somehow intact. Then she saw him. Samuel Mitchell sat on a charred stump near the ruins of his barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his one good arm hanging loosely at his side. Even at a distance, Margaret could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his body, the posture of a man who had watched his world burn and found himself powerless to stop it. His dark hair was singed at the edges, his clothes blackened with soot and ash, and his face bore the hollow expression of someone whose hope had died along with his dreams. He looked up as the wagon approached, squinting against the sun, and Margaret saw him straighten slightly as he recognized that he had a visitor. Samuel Mitchell was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a man, accustomed to physical labor. His left arm was missing from just below the elbow, the sleeve of his shirt pinned neatly to accommodate the absence, but there was nothing diminished about his presence. Even in his obvious despair, he carried himself with dignity. "I'm afraid you've come at a poor time," he called out, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "If you're looking for the Mitchell place, this is what's left of it." There was no self-pity in his tone, only a tired acceptance that struck Margaret's heart like a physical blow. She climbed down from the wagon, her traveling dress immediately, picking up ash and soot as she walked toward him across the devastated yard. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Margaret Sullivan." She watched as recognition dawned in his brown eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. Samuel rose from the stump, swaying slightly with exhaustion. "Miss Sullivan, Lord Almighty, when did you—" He stopped, running his hand through his hair and leaving streaks of ash. "You weren't supposed to arrive until next week." The lie she'd lived with for days caught in Margaret's throat. She'd changed her travel plans without notice, had fled Chicago like a criminal when her carefully constructed new identity had begun to crumble. Now, looking at this man's obvious distress and the ruins of what should have been their new beginning, together her deception felt like salt in an open wound. I was able to leave earlier than planned," she managed, the partial truth feeling heavy on her tongue. "What happened here?" Samuel's jaw tightened, and she saw his hand clench into a fist. "Fire started around midnight. Spread faster than anything I've ever seen. Lost everything except what I was wearing and managed to carry out. He gestured toward a small pile of salvaged items near the stump where he'd been sitting. Wasn't much I could save with. He glanced at his missing arm, then looked away. Margaret followed his gaze to the meager collection of rescued belongings. A few tools, some clothes, a Bible with a scorched cover, and what appeared to be a small wooden box that had somehow survived the flames. The sight of these pathetic remnants of a life struck her with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with the lingering smoke. "Do you know how it started?" she asked, though something in his expression suggested the answer would not be simple. Samuel's face darkened, and for a moment she saw past his exhaustion to the anger burning underneath. "Oh, I know exactly how it started. 3 men rode out here around 11 o'clock carrying torches and bad intentions. Seems my neighbor to the east, Franklin Garrett, has decided my land would look better attached to his spread." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd come west to escape violence and intimidation, only to find herself in the middle of what sounded like a land war. "They burned you out deliberately." "Garrett's been after this section for 2 years, Samuel explained, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced despair. "It's got the best water access for miles around, and my forge sits right where he wants to build a road to town. He's made 3 offers, each one insultingly low, and each time I've refused. Last month his offers turned to threats." Margaret looked around at the devastation with new understanding. This wasn't just a tragic accident, but a deliberate act of cruelty designed to drive Samuel from his land. The calculated nature of it made her stomach turn, reminding her uncomfortably of the kind of men she'd fled Chicago to escape. "What will you do now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Men like Garrett rarely stopped after one attack, and a one-armed man alone against multiple opponents faced impossible odds. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ruins of his home. "I honestly don't know," he admitted, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made Margaret's chest tighten. "I've got enough saved to rebuild, barely, if I do most of the work myself, but Garrett's made it clear this won't be the last visit from his men. Next time, they might not be content with just burning buildings." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Margaret realized she was looking at a man who had reached the end of his resources, both financial and emotional. The confident landowner, who had written those careful, hopeful letters seeking a wife, now sat among the ashes of his dreams, facing an enemy he couldn't defeat alone. "I release you from our agreement," Samuel said suddenly, his words formal, but weighted with genuine regret. "This isn't what you signed up for, Miss Sullivan. No woman should be asked to walk into this kind of situation. I'll arrange passage back to town, and from there, wherever you wish to go. I'll cover your expenses, of course." Margaret stared at him, surprised by the generosity of his offer, even in his own desperate circumstances. Here was a man who had lost everything but was still thinking of her welfare before his own. It was so different from the self-serving behavior she'd grown accustomed to that she almost didn't know how to respond. "Where would I go?" she heard herself ask, the question escaping before she could stop it. The truth was, she had nowhere to return to. No family waiting, no life to resume. Chicago was closed to her now, and she'd burned her bridges as surely as Garrett had burned Samuel's home. Samuel looked up at her with surprise. "Back east, I assumed. To your family, your previous life." Margaret shook her head slowly, feeling the weight of her secrets pressing against her chest. "There is no previous life to return to, Mr. Mitchell. I came west because I had no other choice." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, But looking at this honest man sitting in the ruins of his world, she couldn't bring herself to add more lies to an already tragic situation. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a recognition of shared desperation that created an unexpected bond between them. "What happened?" he asked gently, and Margaret was struck by how his first response was compassion rather than suspicion. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. The whole truth was still too dangerous to share, but she could offer him honesty about her circumstances, if not the details that had created them. "I worked as a seamstress in Chicago, in a shop that catered to wealthy clients. I became involved with someone I shouldn't have, a married man with political connections and a violent temper. When I tried to end the relationship, he made it clear that leaving wouldn't be an option." Samuel's jaw tightened, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "He threatened you." "More than threatened. When I finally found the courage to run, I discovered he'd been watching me, controlling my movements more than I'd realized. I had to leave everything behind, change my name, create a new identity. Your advertisement seemed like providence, a chance to disappear completely while building something worthwhile with someone who needed what I could offer." The silence that followed her confession stretched long enough for Margaret to regret her honesty. Samuel studied her face as if trying to read the full story she hadn't told, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "What name did you leave behind?" Margaret hesitated, then realized that if she was going to trust this man, she needed to offer him something real. Catherine Morrison. "I was Catherine Morrison for 28 years before I became Margaret Sullivan 3 months ago." Samuel nodded slowly, absorbing this information without judgment. "Well then, Margaret Sullivan, it seems we're both people with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. The question is, what do we do about it?" The question hung in the air as the afternoon sun began to sink lower toward the horizon, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of flames. Around them, the ruins of Samuel's homestead stood as testament to the violence that had driven them both to this moment, but also as a challenge to their determination to build something better from the ashes. Margaret looked at this man she'd agreed to marry, taking in his exhaustion, his pain, and his stubborn refusal to surrender completely to despair. Samuel Mitchell might have lost his home and his security, but he hadn't lost his fundamental decency or his willingness to protect others, even when he could barely protect himself. It was more than she dared hope for when she'd answered his advertisement. "We rebuild," she said simply, the words carrying more conviction than she'd felt about anything in months. "We rebuild, and we make sure Garrett understands that burning us out once doesn't mean he's won." Samuel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You want to stay, even knowing what you'd be walking into?" Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling something she'd almost forgotten stir within her chest. Purpose, direction, the chance to fight for something instead of merely running from it. "Mr. Mitchell, I've spent the last 3 months running from one dangerous man. I'm tired of running. If I'm going to face danger anyway, I'd rather do it while building something worthwhile with someone I can trust." For the first time since her arrival, Samuel's expression shifted towards something that might have been hope. "It won't be easy. Garrett has money, men, and political connections. We'll be starting from nothing, building with targets on our backs." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Margaret replied, surprised by her own determination. "And I'm not afraid of Franklin Garrett. Men like him rely on fear and intimidation because they're fundamentally cowards. Stand up to them properly, and they often crumble." Samuel studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the sense he was seeing her clearly for the first time, looking past the refined appearance and careful manners to something stronger underneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. In that case, Miss Sullivan, I believe we have work to do. But first, we need shelter for the night and a plan for tomorrow. The old line shack about a mile north is still standing. It's not much, but it'll keep the weather off us while we figure out our next move. As they loaded the wagon with Samuel's salvage belongings, Margaret felt the strange sensation of stepping into a life she'd never imagined for herself. 3 days ago, she'd been Catherine Morrison, a frightened woman fleeing across the country to escape a violent man's obsession. Now she was Margaret Sullivan, partner to a one-armed blacksmith in a land war that could very well cost them both their lives. Yet as the wagon rolled away from the smoking ruins toward an uncertain future, Margaret found herself smiling for the first time in months. She'd come west looking for escape and found something better, a chance to stop running and start fighting back. Whatever came next, she would face it standing upright instead of looking over her shoulder. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly around them, vast and unforgiving, but also full of possibility. Somewhere in that immensity, she and Samuel would carve out a place to call home, build something worth defending, and prove that sometimes the strongest foundations are laid in the ashes of what came before. The real work was just beginning. Dawn brought the sound of hammering that pulled Margaret from restless sleep. She found Samuel already at work behind the line shack, using salvaged nails to construct what appeared to be a workbench. His movements were efficient, despite working with one arm. Years of adaptation evident in how he braced lumber with his body, while his right hand wielded the hammer with practiced precision. "You're an early riser," Margaret observed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Garrett's men burned my forge, but they couldn't burn my skills," Samuel replied, without pausing in his work. "Every blacksmith needs tools, and I intend to be back in business within the week." Margaret watched him work, impressed by his determination to rebuild so quickly after losing everything. "What can I do to help?" Samuel's hammer stilled mid-swing. "You don't need to. We're partners in this venture," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I didn't come west to be decorative. Put me to work." What followed were the most physically demanding days of Margaret's life. She learned to sort salvaged materials, separating usable lumber from charred debris. Her soft hands developed blisters as she helped Samuel construct a temporary forge from fieldstones and clay. When her stitching skills proved valuable for creating bellows from salvaged leather, Samuel's respect for her grew visibly. By the third day, smoke rose once again from Samuel's workspace as he fired his makeshift forge for the first time. Margaret felt a surge of pride watching him shape red-hot iron with the same skill that had once made him prosperous. Word spread quickly through the area that Mitchell was back in business, and neighbors began arriving with work that had accumulated during his absence. "Folks around here depend on you more than I realized," Margaret commented after a particularly busy morning of horseshoe repairs and tool sharpening. "A good blacksmith is essential to any farming community," Samuel replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Garrett might have burned my buildings, but he can't destroy what people need." Their partnership settled into a natural rhythm. Margaret proved adept at managing the business side of the operation, keeping accounts and scheduling work, while Samuel focused on the demanding physical labor of metalworking. Her education served them well as she corresponded with suppliers and negotiated better prices for materials. The transformation wasn't just practical. Samuel's confidence returned as he saw his livelihood rebuilding from nothing. Margaret found strength she hadn't known she possessed, her fears about her past receding as she focused on creating their future. They worked side by side each day, their conversations growing easier and more personal as trust developed between them. Then Garrett made his next move. Margaret was alone at the forge, Samuel having ridden to town for supplies, when 3 men approached on horseback. She recognized their leader immediately from Samuel's descriptions, Franklin Garrett himself, a thick-set man with cruel eyes and expensive clothes that looked out of place on the frontier. "So you're the woman fool enough to tie herself to Mitchell," Garrett said without preamble, his voice carrying the casual contempt of someone accustomed to intimidating others. Margaret straightened to her full height, refusing to show the fear that twisted in her stomach. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, Mr. Mitchell's business partner. How may I help you?" Garrett's laugh was ugly. "Business partner, that's rich. You can help by convincing your one-armed boyfriend to accept my generous offer and move on before someone gets hurt." "The only person likely to get hurt is someone who threatens innocent people," Margaret replied coolly, her voice steadier than she felt. One of Garrett's men nudged his horse closer, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. "Lady's got a mouth on her, boss. Maybe she needs a lesson in frontier manners. Touch her, and you'll answer to me." Samuel's voice cut across the yard like a whip. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held casually but ready. Margaret had never been so glad to see anyone in her life. Garrett's expression darkened. "Mitchell, still too stubborn for your own good, I see." "Still too honest to be bought," Samuel replied, walking closer but keeping the rifle ready. "You've got no business on my land, Garrett." "Your land?" Garrett's voice rose mockingly. "Look around, Mitchell. I own everything from here to the river. Your little patch is the only holdout, and it won't be for long." Samuel's jaw tightened. "The deeds recorded legally. This land is mine until I choose to sell. Deeds can be challenged. Accidents happen. Fires start." Garrett's threat was barely veiled, especially when people don't listen to reason. Margaret stepped forward, her fear transforming into anger. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Garrett?" Garrett's eyes fixed on her with calculating interest. "Just pointing out realities, miss. The frontier can be dangerous for folks who don't have proper protection." "We have all the protection we need," Margaret replied firmly, moving to stand beside Samuel. Their shoulders touched, presenting a united front that seemed to surprise Garrett. "For now," Garrett conceded, pulling his horse's reins, "but winter's coming, and isolated folks sometimes don't make it through the cold months. Tragic, really." After Garrett and his men rode away, Margaret found herself shaking with reaction. Samuel noticed immediately, his concern evident as he set aside his rifle and moved to her side. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "Standing up to men like Garrett takes courage." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, surprised to find herself being honest about her fear. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Samuel replied gently. "It's doing what's right despite being afraid. You've got more backbone than most men I know." That evening, as they sat by the fire planning their next steps, Samuel broached the subject that had been unspoken between them. "Margaret, I need to ask you something important." She looked up from the ledger she'd been updating, noting the serious tone in his voice. "What is it?" "When I placed that advertisement, I was looking for a wife in name as well as partnership. Someone to share, a life with, not just work beside." Samuel's voice was careful, respectful. "But circumstances have changed everything. I won't hold you to promises made under different conditions." Margaret set down her pen, considering her words carefully. Over the past weeks, she'd come to genuinely admire this man who faced adversity with determination and treated her with respect she'd rarely experienced. What had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into something deeper. "What are you asking, Samuel?" "I'm asking if you'd consider making our partnership permanent. Not just for convenience or protection, but because..." He paused, searching for words. "Because I've come to care for you more than I expected. More than I probably have the right to, given how we met." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his confession. "And I've come to care for you as well. More than I thought possible when I first answered your letter." Samuel's face lit with hope. "Then you'll marry me? Truly marry me, not just go through the motions for appearance's sake." "Yes," Margaret replied, the word carrying all her conviction. But not until we've dealt with Garrett. I won't start our marriage under the shadow of his threats. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Margaret woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Samuel moving urgently around the cabin. "They're back," he said grimly, grabbing his rifle. Fires started at the forge. Outside, flames were already consuming the temporary workshop they'd labored to build, but this time they were ready. Samuel had prepared for another attack, positioning buckets of water and sand strategically around their property. Margaret grabbed buckets while Samuel took position to watch for Garrett's men. "There!" Samuel called, pointing toward the tree line where 3 figures on horseback waited. "They expect us to panic, abandon the forge to save the cabin." Instead, Margaret and Samuel worked together with practiced efficiency, their weeks of partnership serving them well. While Samuel kept watch, Margaret fought the fire with determination born of protecting something they'd built together. The forge was saved, though damaged, and Garrett's men retreated when they realized their target wouldn't be easily intimidated. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Word of the second attack had spread through the community, and neighbors arrived offering help and expressing outrage at Garrett's tactics. Margaret realized that Samuel's reputation and their hard work had earned them support they hadn't expected. "Garrett's overplayed his hand," explained Tom Henderson, a neighboring farmer who'd brought his sons to help repair the fire damage. "Folks around here believe in fair dealing. What he's doing to you could happen to any of us." The community support emboldened Samuel to take action he'd been considering. "It's time to involve the territorial marshal," he told Margaret as they surveyed the damage. "Garrett's crossed the line from intimidation to arson." The marshal's investigation moved swiftly, once presented with evidence and witness testimony. Within a week, warrants were issued for Garrett and his men. Faced with legal consequences and community opposition, Garrett's carefully constructed influence began to crumble. Margaret and Samuel were married on a crisp October morning, surrounded by the neighbors who had become their allies. The ceremony took place beside their rebuilt forge, symbolizing their triumph over those who'd tried to destroy their dreams. As they exchanged vows, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her from a terrified woman fleeing her past to a confident partner building a future. Samuel's steady strength had given her the security to become herself again, while her determination had helped him rebuild more than just buildings. "I take you not just as my husband," Margaret said when it came time for personal vows, "but as my partner in every sense. We've proven we can build something beautiful from ashes." Samuel's response was equally heartfelt. "You came to my life when I had nothing left to offer but hope. You helped me remember that sometimes the best foundations are laid when we think we've lost everything." Their kiss sealed not just their marriage, but their partnership in every sense, witnessed by a community that had rallied to protect what they represented. The possibility of new beginnings and the strength found in facing adversity together. 6 months later, their new house stood completed, larger and more solid than what Garrett's men had destroyed. The forge prospered as Samuel's reputation for quality work spread throughout the territory. Margaret's business skills had expanded, their operation beyond simple blacksmithing to include a small general store that served the growing community. Garrett himself had fled the territory ahead of his trial, his political connections unable to protect him from the weight of evidence and public opinion. His abandoned property was divided among smaller farmers, creating the diverse community Samuel had always envisioned. Standing in their doorway on a spring evening, watching Samuel teach a neighbor's children to work simple metal, Margaret marveled at how completely her life had transformed. The frightened woman who'd fled Chicago no longer existed, replaced by someone stronger and more complete than she'd ever imagined possible. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, joining her in the doorway after his impromptu lesson ended. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of the man who'd become her anchor and her wings. "Only that it took a fire to bring us together." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes the best things grow from the ashes of what came before." As the Dakota sunset painted their valley in shades of gold and rose, Margaret Sullivan Mitchell smiled at the truth of those words. From the ruins of their separate pasts, they'd built something neither could have achieved alone. A love strong enough to weather any storm, and a partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but their entire community. The frontier had tested them with fire and threat, and they'd emerged not just surviving, but thriving. Together, they'd proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes from building something new with someone who believes in your worth, even when you've forgotten it yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.